All right, so welcome everybody. This is the first time I am emceeing one of the center's talks. Very exciting. My colleague James Withrow, who usually does this, is in the U.S. right now on business. But so welcome to the center, especially if you haven't been here before. So I will briefly introduce the professor who will introduce Professor Fishbane this evening. So as you know, we're quite near the campus of Renmin University right now. We'd like to thank the School of Philosophy at Renmin University for collaborating with us on this talk. So I'm going to introduce Professor Xinzhong Yao. So he is a professor in the School of Philosophy, but also in the past has also been the director of the King's China Institute at King's College London. And then prior to that appointment, he was a professor of religion and ethics at the University of Wales and also a senior research fellow at the University of Oxford. So he's written a number of influential books about Confucianism, including the Encyclopedia of Confucianism. So thank you for being here today. And thanks also briefly to Moishe House, which is an organization for young Jewish professionals here in Beijing, for also having a few people here today. So Professor Yao, thanks for joining us. Dean, yeah. Dean of the school.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. It's my great pleasure to be here and to be this kind of very impressive and Chicago center. And this is the first time I come here, and this is the great and the place. And I'm sure everybody in the visit here would be impressed by the generosity in space, and the adequate and in terms of this kind of facilities and also hospitality of this staff. This is also my great honor to introduce Professor Michael and Fishbane, and probably he would not needed me to introduce. His publications speak volume for his achievements in the scene. But what I wanted to say is this, from my research, my study, I found this there is a greater similarity between the Jewish and the Chinese, also called Confucian understanding of life, society, and also ethical issues, problems. So I did, quite many years ago, a book called Wisdom in Early Confucian and Israelite Traditions. And during that time, I spent some time to study Hebrew, and I think this is one of the most difficult languages I ever studied. And but I also it's very easy to forget. Difficult to learn, but easy to forget. I think this is probably one of the reasons why I've been invited here to introduce Professor Fishbane, and his book I certainly referred to when I wrote my book, and so in this sense I could be called a student of you, and today this is the great chance for me to be in the audience to listen to your speech on the what is it and this stages of life, and this is the task according to Jewish ethics and religion. Okay, shall I turn to this and welcome our speaker today.
Well, firstly, it's my very great pleasure to be here, and it's a very honorable Jewish tradition to firstly express gratitude. Gratitude is a fundamental Jewish virtue, and so I primarily want to express my deep gratitude to Beth Bader for all the great kindnesses she's done, hospitality, and being here at the Chicago Beijing Center has been a great honor, and I'm very much appreciative of that. And I'm grateful to everybody who's come out this evening as well. I've just, the last couple of days, what brought me to China was an international conference at Shandong University that was dealing actually with relationship between Jewish ethics and Confucianism. And Confucian ethics, and this was quite eye-opening to me, very enlightening, precisely because so much that I learned of the desire of the Chinese scholars to reconstruct culture, reconstruct values based on the Chinese tradition, but this extraordinary openness to other cultures and other traditions to begin to learn by comparative conversation, similarities and differences. One of the great themes that was emerging was the way certainly Judaism has gone through stages of rupture and transformation, of break and renewal, and how these processes have been transformed through the history of interpretation, and how interpretation tries to retrieve aspects of the past and to renew them in new ways. A great number of the colleagues, particularly the Chinese colleagues, were dealing very much with this issue of this transformation. And then, of course, the other issue was both Judaism and the Chinese civilization are just fundamentally ancient civilizations in which culture and religion and values and ethnicity are so deeply embedded and intertwined. And so that also brought together these two very great ancient civilizations, which are also undergoing these massive transformations of how to deal with modernity. And that was Judaism is still dealing with the crisis of modernity since the 18th century, and China has been going through that through various waves. And then, of course, since the Cultural Revolution, how people are talking about how the reconstruction of that. It's extremely moving. So that I say this both to indicate why I'm here, but also indicate why I chose the topic that I chose. I wanted to build upon what we were dealing with at Shandong University, and particularly to try to use this as an opportunity and an occasion to talk about how does a civilization, a religion, a culture, a religious culture like Judaism establish the stages of life and the stages of cultural growth and the formation of a person. So it will allow me an opportunity to share some thoughts with you about that and give me the great opportunity to learn from you how you see your culture going through these stages and how you understand the stages of life and how a culture tries to facilitate that. So as a way of leading into the subject, what I'd like to do is to just initially pose a number of questions that I'd like you to be bearing in mind that raises this to a much larger cultural and philosophical level so that you can be bearing these in mind, and then I want to address them through a series of texts and their interpretation. So I would begin by opening up this fundamental question of culture. And it is, how does a culture formulate the ideal formation of the self? How does it conceive of the ideal formation of the self? And how does it then establish patterns of culture that allow the cultural self to emerge and develop? The analogical issue, the parallel issue, is how does a religion establish a certain ideal formation? What is the ideal structure of the culture and the ideal structure of the self? And how do the two work together? So that's the first question of notions of ideal formation and the patterns that would be established to maintain a tradition and continue a tradition so that the self grows in a stratified cultural way, building on ancient sources and becoming a new person, but continuing that. It's a fundamental issue for classical Judaism. Any way that modern Judaism wants to deal with that, it has to deal with that retrieval. And I have learned so much that this is an issue also for Chinese civilization. So then a third question that's related to that is how do, say, Judaism or any culture deal with the transformation from the natural self to the cultural self? That people are born in nature and they're natural beings, but they become cultural beings. And how does the culture try, through what we might call a cultural pedagogy, a way of instruction, transform the natural self into an ideal cultural self? And what are the ways that it marks that out? And to maybe to borrow or adapt a phrase of Foucault, to talk about the archaeology of the cultural imagination. What are the strata that a person would need to go through? So that's the notion of the person. And how is that related to cultures that are fundamentally textual cultures? So that part of the notion of the ideal formation of the self is to turn the human being into a living embodiment of the sources. Certainly for Judaism, this is a fundamental ideal, to embody the sources and to live them out in a thoughtful and living manner. But the ideal person is a person who is an archaeology of the sources, a way of that self. And then the final issue that you can be bearing in mind as we move in this way is the self that is being cultivated only responsible for that self? Or is the self responsible for the culture and the tradition as a whole? So what is the balance point in a traditional culture between the cultivation of self and the cultivation of the tradition and responsibility for a larger ethnicity or tradition? Now, in using the term stages of growth, some of you obviously may associate two famous Western examples, which I'm using as straw persons, we might say, to establish that, because they are in a certain sense different. When I was your age, the writings of Erik Erikson were all the rage, and he wrote a famous book on childhood and society. He was a lay analyst and a student of Freud, but he tried to establish the 8 stages, the life stages of a person in the Western world, and very much focused on what we would now call Western individual values of autonomy. So his stages, of course, begin with the issue of basic trust or distrust, the beginning of initiative or the fear of initiative, the development of autonomy or the fear of autonomy. And gradually that self would move towards what he would call integrity. That is to say that the person looks back at their individual achievement as a life person and says, I have integrated my life in an interesting and valuable way. Or a person at that point says, it's too late, I can't do it, my life is diffuse, I can't have retrospective on my life in a coherent way. Now, for all of the value and the social psychological value, he also, when he was teaching at Harvard, he was in the social relations department, so it was understood to be within the context of society, but at the same time, it's very much focused on Western individual values of the self, autonomy, individualism, and there's very little about that the self grows in relation to a tradition or in relationship to a larger society. But nevertheless, he articulates that there is a stratification of the self. The self goes through various layers. It may go through various loops, but the self grows. The other Western ideal stage that many of you may have encountered in your studies, of course, is more from the more philosophical and ethical side. And Professor Yao, I'm sure, is familiar with the Kohlberg studies of the stages of the moral self. Kohlberg actually developed this at the University of Chicago and wrote his dissertation on that, and then it became very famous when he went to Harvard and, in philosophy and education. But it really is a Chicago phenomenon, so we can celebrate that in this context. But for Kohlberg is developing, how does moral reasoning develop? And what is the ideal moral stages? How does a person go from conventional morality, let us say, that I do because I've been told to do it, or I do it because it's right, or I do it because I'm afraid that I'm going to be punished, or I'm going to be blamed, or at a later stage I sort of hope that if a person does something wrong, they're going to get it from the judge, or get it from somebody else, or have a lightning bolt come down from heaven, however that judgment is going to come. But wrongs have to be balanced with some kind of karmic balance, whether it's done by the courts or it's done by other people. And then gradually a person may say, well, no, that is not the way we want to think. There's no simple retribution or balance between actions and their punishments. What we need to do is to think about this. The higher self would think about this in more independent terms, and then the highest self, he says, is like a messianic person. He thinks in global, universal, spiritual terms. But it's to become an autonomous moral agent. And he doesn't really talk about the growth of the moral self in the context of a traditional society. And so that is sort of my segue towards Judaism, and then I want to keep it in the larger context of Confucianism, and I hope that you will raise these issues as we go forward. So what I want to do is articulate one very particular text that says it in a very concise manner. It comes from the Jewish wisdom tradition, the rabbinic wisdom tradition, and then to discuss a quite unique document from the 16th century from the city of Safed or Tzfat, those of you who know Hebrew, where this was discussed in a very unique and commentary on how to make good use of your time. That's how it begins. One has to be aware that one lives life as a person in time, and how do you think about your life in time? So the work in which this is found is sometimes called the Ethics of the Fathers. Some of you who know Hebrew would be called Pirkei Avot. It's not the exact translation. It's really the major chapter headings or the major topics of ethical sayings. But for our purposes, that would do. So let me briefly translate the text, and then I want to explicate it as a way of talking about these stages, the Jewish life stages, and the ideal self, and to see how the self becomes a textual self, and the textual self is the person who continues and develops culture. So the teacher who is being cited, and I'll just go through this, but you'll see how laconic it is, and then how it's elaborated in such an interesting way. That a person is 5 years old. The person is first introduced to what the text calls mikra, that is to say, written scripture, the foundational written sources of the culture. So that's the first level of inculcation of culture. That person gets the foundation. Cultures are often based on foundational documents, and the foundational document of Judaism and the religions that stem from Judaism is the written scripture of Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and in this case, all of scripture. When a person becomes 10, they are taught what is called Mishnah, which is to say the oral tradition and its norms. That is to say, the movement from the written tradition to the oral tradition that tries to allow the culture to live in new and transformed ways in terms of its legal norms. When a person becomes 13, we will see that this person becomes for the first time a religious and moral agent, what is often called a bar mitzvah, a person who is responsible to be an agent of the culture. At 18, the person gets married, or that is the first time that they would be engaged to the wife. At 20 is this period of expansion and proliferation of erotic and economic and personal energy. This is the time that the person becomes diffused in terms of creating themselves, activating inner stages of development, working in the world, establishing a home, and so on. That's all it says about it at this point. When a person reaches 30, that is the time of a certain type of strength. So this we'll see has to be interpreted. What is cultural strength when a person moves from simply being what Strauss once called from the horizontal level, in which you relate to people at your horizontal generational level, and then you become responsible for culture in a vertical manner. That the continuation of culture becomes your responsibility as you become a father or a mother and responsible for the transmission in a different way. At 40, a person enters wisdom, and we will see that the dealing with the life crisis, being aware of mortality, becomes the issue that changes the self, that one realizes that a certain peak has been reached, and one has to now reflect, have you been living a way of value that one can integrate as one begins to think about death. At 60, a person enters sagehood, 50, sagehood, and then at 60, a certain form of wisdom, and we will see that this requires certain kinds of explication. So let me begin to go through this as a way in which this ancient text was commented on in the 16th century, and we can go through some of these stages. But as the person goes through the teaching of this material, they're trying to sift from the tradition to try to idealize what these stages are and how a person becomes a cultural self. So I will slightly also sift the material, but you'll see that at each of these points, it's not just the natural movement, but it's how the culture tries to shape the natural self. So that first level that we wanted to talk about is the first level which traditional societies would talk to memorize and to learn the foundation documents. And in a certain way, the text, the self becomes a textual self. It's very interesting that at the level of, at 5 years old, the person is not supposed to reflect on these issues, not to think about them, but it's like this first injection of culture in which the self learns the alphabet, learns the text, learns the written tradition, so that this becomes, as it were, the foundational ground upon which things begin to emerge. The second level, which we said was this level called Mishnah, which is the level of the legal norms, goes through a huge gap. There's a huge gap between the foundational text, which is called the written tradition, and all the oral ways in which lawyers or teachers or sages try to make an ancient text work for the modern period. And it's on the basis of these norms that the cultural life is structured. So the educational move is first to realize what the foundational text is, and then immediately to go to the level of the teacher, because the teaching of the Mishnah is now to become aware that culture is changed by the sages and the teachers. It's no longer, let us say, a divine dispensation, but now there's a responsibility of the human agent to continue this in a different way. It's at this stage that the self begins to develop, according to this, horizontal or lateral relations. one begins the socialization process through what we would call the companionship friendship system of mutual study. That people begin to share the levels of the meaning of culture, and they begin to develop a cultural discourse between friends. And that this becomes a fundamental feature of the horizontal relationship, that friends teach each other. In Judaism, this is a fundamental issue, challenge each other. And they also, it's very interesting what he says, is that before a person gets married in this very older civilization at 18, they actually are helping each other deal with erotic issues by sublimating them through cultural study. That is to say, there's huge amount of different kinds of energies that a person is developing at an early stage in a traditional culture. And this text is actually quite open about the fact that they have to be channeled and focused through a buddy system of talking about the text and growing in this way. Now, what becomes, it's only beginning at the age of 15, as one is moving towards marriage, that what is called in rabbinic literature Gemara, or you've heard the term Talmud, which is the ongoing tradition, but they understand it in a very specific way. This is the first level of logical and legal reasoning. Because in this level of the tradition, the issue is, what is the relationship between the ongoing oral tradition and the norms and the foundation document? Teaching a person how to think about that relationship and the connection becomes that first introduction to the thought of a culture. In traditional cultures, if they're going to develop, and as Judaism is going to develop, the ideal is that one changes and reinterprets, but one has to think hermeneutically in a certain cultural way. We sort of think today in a postmodern world that you can develop any kind of form of interpretation, or it's an open-ended interpretation, or it's endless, depending on whether you're a student of Derrida and so on and so forth, and there is no truth. But traditional civilizations at this stage introduce what we would call hermeneutical rules. That is to say, there are specific ways of interpreting culture, specific ways of interpreting texts. And when you are enculturated into this way of reasoning and thinking, you become a cultural agent, because then you can be allowed to think further about the culture and move forward. So that becomes a form of cultural regulation. The regulation is that you learn to think the way the sages thought, and the logical structures of the education are to deal with that. It's very interesting that in the Middle Ages, one of the famous philosophers of the Middle Ages, Maimonides, when he was trying to adapt Greek and Aristotelian thinking into Judaism, he wrote his code to summarize all the complex discussions in the Talmud so that a person could begin to follow what Plato and Aristotle says, to learn logic as one of the stages of the ideal cultural way. Logic, obviously, in the medieval Christian world, through the trivium, is one of the major forms. The dialectic of the Talmud, Maimonides said, is the introduction to logic and the forms of logic, so that one can become an independent person to think in cultural terms. Okay. Now, the next stage I had mentioned is called lirdof. It's a very odd Hebrew term, and it sort of means this expansion of the self, the seeking outward of the self that becomes, as it were, what the text calls ma'aseh. A person becomes a doer, an agent, a maker. Those of you who have ever read Hannah Arendt's famous book on the human condition, the notion of the self as a maker, as a culture builder, is a key and crucial issue. But what is very interesting here is that the text is saying that although the person, the ideal self, is now beginning to get engaged in business and try to establish a family and build a life of economic achievement. So that's the first level in which eros is dispersed through economic growth, through building a family, to being a responsible husband and supporting the family in this classical sense. Immediately in this text, the notion is the introduction of what we would call today business ethics. So the notion of ma'aseh, of deed, is immediately correlated at the first level with what we'd call business ethics. That if you've gone through this education, you're not just to be engaged in business, but you have to have a second order thinking about what are the ethical implications. So one of the key term in Jewish business ethics is something called ona'ah, cheating or dissembling or making a person think that the goods or the value is different than it is, whether that's done in an explicit or an implicit way. And so the concern is to deal with that. And then what's very interesting in this particular text, the duty and the responsibility to pay workers at the end of their day. This is 16th century, so that they don't come home hungry. And if a person should think that they are suffering because they have to give all of their money to the worker, the text says you should regard your relationship to your worker as an aspect of charity and supporting of the world. So, to see the goal of work as fulfilling one's religious ideals. So this second level of what we said was labor, what the Latin tradition calls homo faber, the man, the human being who's the maker, also has to become the religious agent of learning the religious and ethical tasks and performing those in the culture in a serious manner. So the text cites a very famous section from Judaism that simply reflective or contemplative thinking is not sufficient. It's the actualization or the implementation. So what you know in the culture or traditional culture is only important if you can make it real in the personal self or the cultural self. Now the next level is this issue when a person becomes 30 of strength. And here, a person, the ideal self, tries to come to a certain kind of reasonable balance point. It's sort of the beginning of sobriety, the beginning of reflective value. And it's very interesting that in this particular moment, the self becomes aware of its responsibility to be a father and a teacher. And teaches now begins to teach not just horizontally, but vertically. One's friend's son, the son that you had been studying with, teaching the son, and beginning to transmit the tradition to the son, and so on. They use a number of interesting phrases, which I'll translate from the Hebrew. One is to awaken consciousness in the son. That the son becomes an agent of this continuity. I mention this specifically because I learned something quite remarkable from a very one of the famous scholars of Confucianism who was at the conference that I had in his notion of filial piety of Chao. He said that one of the ideals was that the son has to learn from the father what the cultural ideals are and to continue the destiny of the father, the parents, into the next generation. That was one of the ways of giving pleasure and honor to the parent is to understand what the parent has been trying to achieve culturally and personally in their lifetime and extending that through that self into the next generation. That notion I thought was extraordinary. It's not things that Westerners think about, And as we say, my mind was really blown away by that, because he said the only way that can happen is by parent-child intimacy. That the parents really tell the child what was concerned to me and how do I want my life to be continued. So this is, in a certain sense, what is being described in this Jewish source. The father opens the eyes of the child to what the destiny of the culture is, and how that child can become a responsible continuation. Now, in this case, it's not called the filial piety as in this text, but it is the celebration of the son who can, or the child who can perform this particular action. The second is that the father doesn't simply give the teachings, but it says, lahadricho al derech hayashar, that a person has to bring a person into the morally upright manner. It's not simply giving the norms, but how to make responsible moral judgments in ambiguous situations. So part of this transmission of the culture is not just the norms, but through the model of the father or the parent, and through the model of the teaching, to know how to deal with unexpected moral situations. Then there's another phrase that struck me. I had never seen it in any other Jewish source. He says, a person has to inculcate these values so that first nature becomes second nature. He's talking about that moral values should become so habitual that they become second nature. They actually use the term teva sheni, second nature. But what we use as a term coming in from the Greek traditions of how one's nature, human nature, is transformed. But here they're saying that this human primary nature has to become secondary nature through culture and through this moral culture. And then the other thing that's related to this, which was quite astonishing in this case, is that a person has to be responsible for all other people in the culture. So the father, let us say, or the parent, is not just responsible for that person's immediate child, but takes a responsibility for all other persons in the culture. There's a particular term for that, arevin. People have to be intertwined in their life, and that becomes the point when this teacher says that this is what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. That is to say, you see the larger tradition and the corpus of the culture as part of yourself, so that your lack of engagement with the other at a moral or spiritual or social level is an act of selfish autonomy that does not serve the larger goal. And it actually makes a critique of the self that is self-centered in this particular way. So one should love one's neighbor as oneself, as one would want to be treated, this golden norm, golden mean, which of course is so fundamental to Confucius and Confucius tradition. The next stage, and I'll just mention two more of these stages, and then I will bring some of this to a close so we can have a discussion, is the level at being 40 is level called Bina. Now that normally means understanding. But this teacher brings out a very interesting thing. That at a certain point, in this culture, of course, it's 40, but it could be at any other level. At a certain point, he says, you reached a midlife crisis. That is to say, you realize that in an ideal lifespan, you've lived more than you're likely to live in the future. So temporality and finitude, being aware of one's finitude as being a mortality, becomes something that has to be introjected into the self. So that it's not simply what Heidegger would refer to as a kind of dread or fear of death, but it is awareness of time so that the task of culture can be re-energized if one has not done that. So that it's this sense of the limitation of life is now turned as a moral feature so that the self becomes aware of that. It's very interesting. This is already the 16th century, but this is one of the major features, for example, of Spanish Jewish poetry that was influenced by Arabic poetry in the 12th and the 13th century. That at a certain point, one has to awaken oneself to the meaning of finitude. And the awakening of the meaning of finitude is not just this fear and the turn towards the self, but to see what finitude means in terms of continuing the task of the culture that's responsible. So it's not answering it in a Western term that it introduces anxiety, it introduces self-absorption, or a diffuse sense of what has to be done in all the ways that Heidegger and post-Heideggerian thought would deal with that, but that one becomes aware that now I have to make a decision. Am I living my life according to the values that would make me a person and not just a natural self? And that's the way the person deals with that. Are you making the decision now to be the person that one can look reflectively back upon, that one has integrated? So integration, it takes on a different notion. And this becomes the moment of certain kind of contemplative reflection. There are a number of texts that people were encouraged to use as what we would today call mantras or contemplative reflections. And one of those texts would be, a person should reflect or contemplate on three things, and then they won't come into a certain error. So these are kind of some of these notions actually come from Stoic Greek thought and a little bit earlier, but they're transformed into the Jewish context. That a person should reflect on origin. The humility of origin, of being born from sperm and an egg. To take that into consciousness as an extreme notion of humility. The second stage is to be aware of the end of life. That is to say, one turns into worm and ashes. This is the way the text is talking about that. That one comes from a certain sense, nothingness or absolute natural simplicity, as miraculous as it is, and then one returns physically at least to the earth, and use that as a way to say, to whom will a person give ultimate judgment? In this context, of course, it's the divine judgment, but in our context, it's what is the reflective notion that one has to bear in mind, that has to feel responsible to, as when one tries to inculcate mortal or physical limitation. So this becoming aware of finitude is to become aware of the finitude of the body and the transcendence of value, and keeping those values as a kind of higher structure that one feels responsible towards. I want to add one final feature. I won't go through all these others. At the age of 50, and again I bring this in because of some things that we were discussing at this conference. At this point, the person becomes involved with sage wisdom. And it's interesting what they say. It's only at the point where you've become a responsible parent that you can now advise other people in a genuine and responsible way. And the term that's used in the Hebrew is called lehochiach. It means to reprove or to critique a person out of love so that that person will not live a erroneous or a shameful life. And the reason I mentioned, and I was struck by how striking this is, it's only at a certain point in your life that you have the right to critique another, only after you've gone through a series of processes. And this is sort of the ideal stage. And the reason I'm mentioning this it came to me also as one of the wonder of things that I learned, and we were discussing it at length, is that one of the features of filial piety is what the translators of the Analects call remonstrance. That is to say, one has out of love of parent, one has to be able to critique the parent or criticize the parent. And the question is, in what sense is that honor and respect? And obviously, one level is that the parent may, for one or another reason, not be doing this intentionally, or it's a way of preventing the parent from shame. That was one of the terms, or error. But this notion that love is related to critique is not the way we normally think in the West. And these values that as part of one's co-responsibility for tradition and the culture, one has to risk the possibility of entering into moral debate and criticism with another person to talk about the status of value. And that's a way, both in Judaism and as I'm understanding about Confucianism, a way of honoring the tradition that one wants to continue. It looks like you're breaking with it, but in fact you're honoring the larger goal of continuing the values of the tradition. Obviously, the language, the meaning, and the purpose of this is different in Judaism than it would be in Confucianism, but you can see this kind of issue. And then finally, as a person reaches the age of 60, this is the point where death consciousness, this a person is already much older than we would talk about now, but that death consciousness has to be transformed into the limited nature of the day. One has to be always ready that this could be one's last day. It probably is a hard thing for you to think about at your age, but there are people who think about that a lot, and that the day now becomes something different. One doesn't think of a unlimited as a youth does, or a limited future, or the finitude of time when one reaches mid-age. But at certain points, one thinks about the day as filled with a value that younger people would see in a more extended manner. And the person at this life stage has to really integrate that so that the day now becomes the fullest expression of what wanted to achieve in one's lifetime. So let me stop with that and just summarize this in 4 or 5 points, and then we can open up this to questions you might have about Judaism, or comparative questions, or your own reflections on some of these moral and ethical, philosophical topics. So the first issue we talked about is the notion of the cultivation of the self. And the self is not simply cultivated by learning techniques, but by learning values. And that the values have to be actively transmitted through text and the stratification of text, so that the self becomes a living anthology, so that in the right moment, the cultural sources can be articulated at given moments. That becomes a cultural ideal, that one becomes a layering of text to make the right judgment at the right time based on the tradition. It's certainly a key issue in wisdom traditions, as we say. The second issue is this deep awareness of time. The whole structure of life is built upon ideal layered stages, and the text actually says one should not try to deviate. There is a certain kind of layering, what we would call timeliness. One has to grow in a certain kind of a way. You can't be an adult before you're an adolescent. You can't deal with things as a youth. Things that are very much confused in contemporary society for one reason or another, but a more traditional society wants to kind of focus on that in an ideal sense and try to deal with that in a certain way. The third issue is that self-cultivation is not separated from cultivation of the community. Co-responsibility, as soon as one becomes a recipient of culture, one is immediately transformed dialectically into an agent of culture, and so that one wants to be, the connection between the generations is immediately achieved as a transcending moment across the generations of this, and one becomes responsible for the other. This issue of not simply living according to the immediate configuration of phenomena, but in terms of the value that's above it. What the text calls l'shem shamayim, that one does something for the higher intention that needs to be done. One doesn't just work, but one is aware of the implications of treating one's fellow workers and so on, that the religious intentionality becomes the transcending principle within the immediate context that one is doing. The final issue is this layering of tradition, that one learns tradition in stages, and that one wants to become alert to the stage that one's in so that one makes the best use of time. So this notion of ideal stages helps construct what we would call today cultural pedagogy. How do you teach culture? What are the stages? And what any teacher will think about when he walks into a class, and certainly what any parent, is what kind of a person or what kind of a thought, what kind of an issue do I want to emerge from this particular situation? So by having this externalized structure, the culture can then begin to fill it in, over time, change them into the modern period, and so on, but realizing that there is moral and spiritual development that has to go in a specific way, and that the self is not just for the self, but is co-responsible for the transmission of the tradition. So we've seen a number of things in Judaism, some similarities that will be expressed differently in Confucianism, and I want to thank you for your attention. We can have now some time for discussion.